She's a penniless failure, my dad laughed the judge, his voice echoing across the sleek downtown probate courtroom. A few relatives chuckled. I remained perfectly still. Defense was unnecessary when the data was irrefutable. I just stared at the mahogany table, waiting for the exact second his carefully constructed illusion would shatter. This was not a family dispute. It was a reckoning. Judge Eleanor Vance read the top page of my file twice, then looked directly at me. So, they really do not know? My father's lawyer frowned, shuffling his papers. Do not know what, Your Honor? The judge paused, her gaze shifting to my father like a gavel dropping. The truth is, she is. The smugness vanished from my dad's face. He thought this hearing would prove I was a failure chasing Grandma Clara's money. What he did not know was that my formal disclosures were about to permanently dismantle his 20-year narrative. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The truth is, Judge Eleanor Vance continued, her voice slicing through the heavy silence of the downtown probate courtroom, she is a Lead Global Cybersecurity Architect. I watched their reactions not with anger, but with the clinical detachment of someone analyzing a solved equation. For 2 decades, my father and brother had treated my life as a liability, constantly exploiting my supposed vulnerabilities. I had been the silent caretaker in their version of our family, absorbing their cruelty just to maintain an illusion of peace. Now, I recognized that their peace was just a ransom demand, with me footing the bill. Today, I was permanently cutting them off. Judge Vance adjusted her reading glasses, looking over the formal will contest petition my father had filed, which explicitly accused me of being financially destitute to establish a motive for undue influence. Marcus had immediately countered with irrefutable rebuttal evidence. According to the verified financial disclosures submitted by the defense to disprove your baseless claims, the judge stated, her tone entirely devoid of sympathy for the men sitting across from me. She sustains a high 6-figure annual income. She maintains a substantial liquid portfolio well over $750,000. She owns her primary residence outright, with 0 outstanding mortgage liabilities. Michael's smug, condescending sneer, the exact one he wore when claiming I could not even afford my rent, melted into a pale, sickly realization. Beside him, Ryan, the entitled golden child who had never survived a single inconvenience without our father's financial safety net, sat frozen. My brother stared at me as if he were finally seeing the person he had underestimated his entire life. Their shock did not stem from the cruelty of their own fabrications. It stemmed from the sudden realization that their primary target had locked them out. I rested my hands on the smooth leather of my portfolio. Panic and despair were irrelevant metrics. This was not a family breakdown. It was a clinical exposure, and the undeniable truth was finally on public display. My father leaned toward his lawyer, his voice a frantic hiss, demanding an objection. But his attorney simply frowned at the copies of my bank statements, completely unable to dispute the cold, hard data. You cannot cross-examine a wire transfer. You cannot gaslight a tax return. The records demonstrate over a decade of disciplined, highly classified corporate leadership, Judge Vance added, letting the papers drop onto her desk with a heavy thud. My father had built his entire ego on a fabricated reality. Ryan was his triumphant legacy, and I was his tragic, broken burden. He needed me to be destitute to validate his own choices. But my reality was built on verifiable success, hard assets, and absolute independence. My family had spent 2 decades forcing me into a fabricated narrative, banking on my silence to keep their delusion alive. But they had forgotten one crucial detail about security architects. We know exactly how to isolate and neutralize a threat. Methodical, precise, undeniable. I kept my hands folded neatly on the mahogany table, waiting for their fabricated reality to crash completely. They called me a failure because they froze my existence at a single, convenient data point. In their minds, I was permanently 23, shivering in a damp basement studio where a leaky ceiling dripped in time with my mounting anxiety. Back then, I spent my nights huddled under a thin blanket, running relentless spreadsheets to determine if I could afford basic heating after paying my crushing student loan minimums. Operating on a severe deficit, I watched Michael fully fund his golden child. Ryan's lavish lifestyle, the bailed-out credit cards, the down payment on his pristine SUV was heavily subsidized by our father. Michael required Ryan's success to validate his own ego, assigning me the role of the designated scapegoat, the family's bad debt. Pleading for a bailout was an inefficient use of resources. Recognizing their toxic emotional economy, I simply stopped requesting capital. Instead, I established a secure perimeter and began constructing my cybersecurity career, brick by digital brick. The only person who didn't treat my presence as a liability was Grandma Clara. Her sunlit greenhouse, smelling of damp earth and blooming orchids, was the only genuine sanctuary in a house built on lies. She never demanded a performance. We would sit on her garden porch in quiet companionship, far away from Michael's conditional approval. She saw me for who I was, not for what my bank account lacked. This is where the invisible labor paradox takes root. Dysfunctional family structures operate on a deeply flawed accounting method. They glorify loud, performative presence while completely erasing the demanding, unseen caretaking labor usually carried out by the scapegoated daughter. Ryan would show up for a Sunday barbecue, flip a few burgers, laugh loudly for the cameras, and instantly be hailed by Michael as the devoted, loving grandson. Ryan's care was a marketing campaign, high visibility, zero actual substance. My care was administrative infrastructure. I didn't perform for an audience. I was the one quietly routing anonymous transfers to keep Clara's heating bills paid when her fixed income fell short. I built encrypted digital logs to manage her complex medical care, secured her home network against predatory scams, and spent countless Tuesday mornings coordinating her telehealth appointments from my corporate office. It was invisible labor, unseen, uncelebrated, but absolutely foundational to her survival. Michael and Ryan mistook my quiet diligence for abandonment. They assumed that because I wasn't loudly performing at their holiday dinners, I had simply defaulted on my familial obligations. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my work. They assumed love was a public relations stunt. I treated it as a quiet, foundational duty. As I sat in the courtroom watching them scramble, the irony was clinical. They had spent 20 years underestimating the architect who had secretly been maintaining the very servers they stood on. The reading of Grandma Clara's will did not trigger grief in my family. It initiated a hostile takeover. When the estate attorney announced the final valuation, $4,500,000 in property and tech stocks, to be divided equally between Ryan and me, the temperature in the room plummeted. They didn't just challenge the will. They launched a coordinated, scorched earth smear campaign. Within days, Michael and Ryan filed a formal probate motion to seize complete control of the estate. Their legal argument was built entirely on the fiction they had peddled for 2 decades. I was an unstable, destitute daughter who had emotionally abandoned Clara, returning only at the 11th hour to manipulate a frail woman. The social attacks came next. Aunt Patricia, who had spent her life as a complicit bystander, suddenly became their primary attack dog. My phone flooded with her guilt-tripping paragraphs, arriving at all hours of the night. "Your brother needs this capital, Jessica. You've always been so selfish and absent. Do the right thing and sign your share over to Ryan before this ugly legal battle destroys the family." Blocking her immediately would have shown weakness. Defending my character to a compromised source was useless. I simply let the messages populate, silently analyzing their motives. Why were they fighting so viciously? The sheer size of the inheritance was a massive factor, certainly, but the vitriol ran much deeper than simple greed. As I sat in my home office, reviewing the aggressive legal filings they had submitted, the psychology of my family's dynamic finally clicked into place. Michael's hostility was pure, desperate self-preservation. In his carefully constructed family system, the roles were rigidly assigned. Ryan was the golden child, the flawless, triumphant legacy. I was the scapegoat, the broken, cautionary tale. Michael's entire ego depended on that narrative remaining permanently intact. If he acknowledged my success, if he admitted I was a disciplined, high-earning architect who had quietly cared for Clara, his reality would collapse. Acknowledging my competence meant admitting his own colossal parental failure. He didn't just want Clara's money, he needed me to be ruined to validate his own life choices. His cruelty was not an expression of power. It was pathetic, clinical weakness. For years, I had swallowed the societal lie that family bonds required endless grace and compromise. But analyzing their relentless smear campaign, I understood a much deeper truth about toxic dynamics. Sometimes, the greatest liberation is not forgiveness, but the complete and utter severing of ties with the people who hurt you. The reality of my situation proved that cutting off a toxic relationship, even if it is your own family, is an absolute necessity to protect yourself and find true peace. A tearful explanation was out of the question. I owed them hard consequences. Closing Aunt Patricia's message thread, I initialized a new encrypted directory on my laptop. They wanted to inject a false narrative to steal Clara's legacy. But my firewalls were already up. Grief is a vulnerability, but litigation is an algorithm. Wasting a single second mourning my father's smear campaign or my brother's entitled greed was completely inefficient. They wanted to rewrite history to steal Grandma Clara's legacy, treating our shared bloodline like an emotional battlefield. I treated it with absolute, uncompromising boundaries. The moment I closed out of Aunt Patricia's guilt-tripping messages, I completely shut down any lingering sentimentality. Panic and despair were entirely useless. What I needed was structural defense. Retaining Marcus, a premier probate litigator who understood that family affection was an illusion and only digital forensics spoke the truth, was my first countermeasure. Sitting across the polished glass table in his downtown office, I bypassed the emotional pleasantries and handed him an encrypted solid-state drive. Self-pity had no place in this conference room. It was a precise, methodical transfer of evidence. The transition from a passive, silent target into a strong, autonomous woman was fully executed. My father and brother assumed they could win this probate war by shouting the loudest and spreading baseless rumors about my absence. But I am an architect. I do not deal in gossip. I deal in immutable logs. I provided Marcus with 10 years of meticulous, time-stamped records. I gave him the encrypted IP logs, proving my daily video calls with Clara, mathematically refuting their claim of emotional abandonment. I handed over the authenticated bank statements and wire transfers, demonstrating exactly who had been quietly funding her life. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for decades. Now, they were facing the audit. I produced the comprehensive digital footprints of my administrative labor, detailing every single telehealth appointment I had scheduled, managed, and paid for while Michael and Ryan were busy taking performative photos at Sunday barbecues. Marcus reviewed the files in silence, his eyes scanning the irrefutable proof of my constant care. My family had mistaken my historical silence for weakness, assuming I would simply forfeit Clara's entire legacy to keep the peace. They fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of my quiet nature. It was never submission. It was the cold, methodical compilation of a devastating legal counteroffensive. This was no longer a petty family drama fueled by Michael's narcissistic need for control. It was a clinical, forensic excavation of their 20-year lie. Screaming to defend my character was a tactic for the powerless. The architecture of my defense was already compiled, reinforced by years of silent diligence. Marcus closed the folder, and I knew the perimeter was absolutely secure. The trap was deployed, and my father and brother were walking blindly into a meticulously designed execution of justice. The initial shock of my professional success was merely the beginning. Now, it was time for the targeted strike. As the courtroom absorbed the reality of my financial independence, Marcus stood up and approached the bench. He did not offer character witnesses or tearful testimonies about my childhood. He offered a flash drive and a meticulously bound financial forensic report. This was the kill shot. The dispute over Clara's remaining assets was about to pivot from a family disagreement into a documented criminal exposure. Judge Eleanor Vance opened the folder, her eyes scanning the top page. The heavy silence in the room sharpened into something lethal. For 2 decades, Michael had aggressively marketed Ryan as the devoted, selfless golden child, while labeling me the absent failure. But loyalty is not measured in Sunday barbecues. It is measured in bank ledgers. 5 years ago, Ryan exploited Clara's power of attorney, Marcus stated, his voice echoing off the polished wood walls, formally establishing the breach of fiduciary duty. Shortly after, Clara's primary residence was placed in active foreclosure. I watched my brother. Ryan's arrogant posture collapsed instantly. He shrank into his chair, his face flushing a sick, mottled red. Michael whipped his head around to stare at his son, completely blindsided. The architect of my family's misery had no idea that his perfect son was a parasite. When I was 27, newly established as a senior engineer, Clara had called me in a state of absolute terror. The bank was threatening to seize her home. An independent audit revealed exactly why. Ryan had systematically and quietly drained Clara's liquid savings over 3 years. He had siphoned her accounts to cover his hidden personal debts, bleeding her dry while smiling at the dinner table. He had pushed an 86-year-old woman to the brink of homelessness. Confronting him back then would have alerted the threat before I could secure the asset. Emotional outbursts yield a terrible return on investment. Instead, I engineered a quiet, localized bailout. Within 48 hours of Clara's panicked phone call, my funds cleared the entire mortgage default, wiring exactly $142,000 directly to the lending institution, instantly neutralized the arrears and reinstated her mortgage. I kept the transaction strictly confidential, burying the paperwork to protect Clara's dignity. She had been utterly humiliated that her favorite grandson was a thief, and I refused to let her spend her final years feeling ashamed. The records before the court confirmed that Jessica not only saved the property from foreclosure, but she did so using her own heavily taxed income, Marcus continued, relentless and clinical. Furthermore, the forensic tracing proves that the original deficit was caused directly by unauthorized withdrawals made by Ryan. Judge Vance turned her piercing gaze toward the plaintiff's table. There was nowhere for them to hide. They had marched into this courtroom to argue that I had emotionally manipulated a frail woman for her fortune. Instead, the data proved that Ryan had robbed her blind, and I had quietly bought back the roof over her head. The false narrative Michael had built to protect his own ego was officially demolished. There was no path to redemption, only the cold, unyielding architecture of the truth. Judge Eleanor Vance did not just deliver a legal verdict, she methodically dismantled my family's remaining dignity. The silence in the room was absolute as she dismissed their petition with prejudice, permanently affirming me as the sole and rightful heir to the estate. But the reckoning was not over. As my father and brother sat in stunned silence, Marcus calmly walked over to their table and dropped a thick envelope directly in front of Ryan. "Consider yourself served," Marcus stated quietly. "This morning, we filed a separate civil lawsuit against you for breach of fiduciary duty to recover every stolen cent. Furthermore, a copy of this forensic report is already on the district attorney's desk for elder financial abuse review." Aunt Patricia, who had spent the last several weeks flooding my phone with aggressive demands that I surrender my inheritance to save the family, stood up and fled the gallery in utter disgrace. She did not dare look in my direction. Bystanders rarely stick around when the fraudulent foundation they helped protect finally collapses. Stepping out of the heavy wooden courtroom doors and into the bright, sharp sunlight of the parking lot, the air around me felt remarkably clean for the first time in 32 years. My hand rested on my car door handle just as the frantic, uneven sound of footsteps scraped against the pavement behind me. It was Michael, my father, who just hours earlier had sneered across a mahogany table that I could not even afford basic rent, now stood trembling by my driver's side window. His face was a sickly, pale gray, his eyes rimmed with red. The narcissistic arrogance that had fueled his entire existence was completely bankrupt. "Jessica, please," he stammered, his voice cracking in a pathetic display of panic. "You have to drop the restitution order. The criminal referral will destroy him. They are going to put your brother in prison. We are family. You cannot do this to us." Staring at the man who had spent my entire life trying to break my spirit simply to protect his own fragile ego, I felt absolutely nothing. Sadness and pity were luxuries he no longer deserved. I processed only the cold, analytical certainty that the greatest liberation is not forced forgiveness, but the complete and utter severing of ties with those who intentionally cause pain. "I am not doing anything to you," I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional currency. "Ryan stole from a dying woman, and you spent 2 decades funding a parasite while trying to bury me. This is not a family tragedy. This is simply an accounting of your choices, and the invoice is finally past due." Waiting for his desperate rebuttal served no purpose. Sliding into my car, the leather of the steering wheel felt warm and grounding beneath my hands. I held his gaze one last time, pressed the button to roll up my window, and drove out of the lot. He was finally left to face his ruin alone. The probate process concluded exactly as it should have, with clinical, irrefutable efficiency. Clara's legacy was legally finalized and secured entirely under my name. Facing the undeniable forensic evidence, Ryan was forced into an immediate settlement in the civil suit to avoid prison time. He had to rapidly liquidate his lavish lifestyle to repay the stolen funds, bankrupting not just his accounts, but the fragile, entitled ego our father had spent decades inflating. Michael had lost his audience, his golden child's financial safety net, and the fabricated reality he desperately needed to survive. Hoarding the capital was never the objective. Grandma Clara had been targeted because she was vulnerable, manipulated by the very people who were supposed to protect her. I took my share of the inheritance and established a comprehensive digital literacy and cybersecurity initiative for seniors in Clara's honor. It provided encrypted protection, financial monitoring, and dedicated legal support for the elderly. My grandmother's legacy would not be remembered as a family tragedy or a cautionary tale. It would be a permanent firewall, transforming her memory into lasting protection for thousands of others. This was not revenge. It was structural reinforcement. That evening, I returned to the quiet sanctuary of my home. There were no rattling heaters, no cold drafts, and absolutely no frantic, guilt-tripping notifications flooding my screen. The silence in my living room was not lonely. It was the pristine quiet of a perfectly secured network. I sat at my desk and opened my phone's directory. For 32 years, I had maintained their contact information out of a misplaced sense of biological obligation. I had treated family as a mandatory subscription, absorbing their insults and paying the emotional taxes just to keep the peace. But the audit was complete, and the debt was fully discharged. Scrolling to my father's name, I tapped delete. Ryan's number met the same fate. Aunt Patricia was purged next. Blocking them was not an act of rage or sorrow. True emancipation is silent and absolute. Removing their access entirely ensured they were no longer active variables in my life. My peace was finally cleansed of their lifelong toxicity. As the stories of resilience show, the ultimate liberation is not a forced reconciliation, but the absolute severing of ties with abusers, allowing justice to simply take its natural course. I closed my phone and set it on the desk. The house was secure, the perimeter was flawless, and the exhausting noise of their lifelong judgment was permanently silenced. I had constructed my success in the dark, and now, my reality was entirely my own. If you've ever had to build your own success in silence while toxic people prayed for your downfall, drop A in the comments. Subscribe for more stories about people who finally took back their power